Imagine I could replace your brain, one tiny piece at a time, with perfect digital replacements. Your memories will remain. Your personality remains as well. You never notice a break in your experience. Eventually, nothing biological is left. Are you still you? Now imagine something different. Instead of replacing your brain, I make a perfect digital copy of it. The copy remembers your entire life, thinks it is you, and for the sake of the thought experiment, it's genuinely conscious. Is that also you? The problem behind these questions is ancient. It is captured by a philosophical puzzle called the Ship of Theseus. Imagine a wooden ship whose planks gradually rot and are replaced one by one. Eventually, every plank has been replaced. The ship has continued sailing throughout. It has the same name, the same form, and the same history, but none of its original material remains. Is it still the same ship? Now suppose someone kept every old plank. Once all the replacements are complete, they use the original pieces to rebuild another ship. Now there are two. One has the uninterrupted history of the original ship, but none of its original material. The other has the original material, but none of the uninterrupted history. Which one would you say is the original? And this is the point where a fairly sensible maintenance program becomes a philosophical problem. Because underneath the puzzle, it's a real question. What allows something to remain the same thing while its physical parts change? And that, of course, isn't just a question about ships. Our bodies change too. Many cells in the human body are continually replaced. Skin, blood vessels, and the lining of the digestive systems are some obvious examples. Other cells can last far longer. Some neurons may remain with us for most or all of our lives. So our bodies are not replaced completely, but much of their material changes over time. And despite that change, we experience ourselves as the same person. Consider your fingerprints. The surface cells on your fingers are continually shed and replaced. Yet the same ridge pattern remains. The individual cells can change while the underlying biological structure preserves the pattern. That suggests that identity doesn't always depend on keeping the same material. Organization can persist while its components change. But a human being introduces something the ship and the fingerprint do not have: a conscious point of view. And before going any further, there is a rather significant problem we have to acknowledge. We don't actually know what consciousness is. We can study the brain and identify processes associated with the conscious experience. We can observe what changes when consciousness is lost or altered. But why any of those processes should produce an inner experience, it's still unresolved. So if you were hoping I'd solve consciousness in this video, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I can't give you a definition of consciousness that settles the debate, but I can say what seems essential to it from my own experience. There is something it feels like to be me. I experience the world from a particular point of view, and that experience appears to continue throughout time. The person experiencing this moment seems to be the same person who experienced the previous one. For me, any useful idea of human consciousness has to account for that subjective continuity. Memory clearly contributes to that continuity. I remember things from yesterday and recognize them as experiences that involved me. But I don't think having someone's memories necessarily makes you the conscious subject who lived them. If every one of my memories could somehow be copied into you, you might remember my childhood in exactly the same way I do, but I would still be here. So whatever personal identity is, possessing the same memories cannot by itself be the whole answer. This takes us into one of the hardest problems surrounding consciousness. We know the brain processes information. We can study perception, memory, attention, and decision-making. But we also know something from direct experience that is harder to account for. Seeing the color red, for example, feels like something. Feeling pain also feels like something. We don't merely process information about the world, we experience it. Why physical processing is accompanied by subjective experience remains deeply mysterious. And I think that gives us an important distinction. A system can receive information, transform it, and produce a response. That tells us something about what the system does. It doesn't necessarily tell us whether anything is being experienced while it does it. This becomes crucial when we move from human brains to artificial intelligence. AI systems are extraordinarily capable information processors, but is processing information enough for there to be something it feels like to be an AI? And there is another complication. Our conscious experience isn't simply a perfect recording of the outside world. The brain takes sensory signals, interprets them, and constructs the experience we perceive. So even our apparently direct experience of reality depends on processes inside the brain. In a sense, your brain has been quietly editing your version of reality your entire life. And given how little we notice the editing, it's apparently quite good at it. But that raises another question. Is our sense of being one continuous self also something the brain constructs? And if it is, what exactly needs to continue for the same conscious self to continue? We don't currently have a settled answer. Perhaps consciousness comes from particular biological processes. Perhaps it emerges when information is organized in the right way. Perhaps it's something more fundamental that we haven't yet understood. We may even discover that we've been asking some of these questions in the wrong way. But what we do know is that humans report a rich inner experience, and we also recognize it directly in ourselves. Can we confidently say the same about an artificial system? Some researchers already think we should take that possibility seriously. Geoffrey Hinton, for example, one of the pioneers of modern AI, is among those who have argued that machine consciousness should not simply be dismissed. Even more so, he actually went ahead and said that AI is already conscious. And modern AI can certainly behave in ways that make the question tempting. It can reason, discuss complex ideas, and answer questions about itself and the world. But intelligence and consciousness are very different claims. An intelligent answer doesn't necessarily prove there is an experiencer producing it. The difficulty is deciding where the boundary lies. A calculator, for example, processes information, yet few people consider it conscious. Modern AI is incomparably more sophisticated, but increasing sophistication doesn't tell us at which point, if any, subjective experience appears. Does enough complexity produce awareness? Does consciousness require a particular architecture? Does biology matter? We don't know. And the fact that we don't know, it's why I find it so odd when very famous scientists like Geoffrey Hinton and others go ahead and say that AI is already conscious. We don't even know what consciousness is, but we already feel comfortable attributing it to AI. Long conversations with AI reveal another useful distinction. Current systems can maintain context far better than earlier systems such as GPT 3.5, for example. But in sufficiently long or complicated exchanges, they can still lose track of earlier details or misunderstand what remains important. That will continue to improve, of course, but humans forget things too. So context failures are not evidence that AI cannot be conscious. Memory on its own clearly isn't a conscious test. If it were, some Monday mornings would raise difficult questions about all of us. The more interesting question is what, if anything, it's actually continuing throughout the conversation. When I continue a conversation, I experience myself as the same subject who spoke a moment earlier. With AI, we can observe continuity of information. Previous parts of the same conversation influence later responses. But informational continuity and subjective continuity may not be the same thing. Is there an experiencer persisting behind those responses? Or is the appearance of continuity produced by the information available to the system? And this is why asking whether AI can be conscious, it's harder than asking whether AI can be intelligent. Intelligence gives us things we can observe, answers, decisions, reasoning, and behavior. Consciousness asks us to infer something happening on the inside. We already face this problem with other humans, but there we have a powerful reason to make that inference. They have brains and bodies like ours, and report experiences like ours. With an artificial intelligence system built very differently from us, that comparison becomes much less straightforward. So let's maybe stop asking whether today's AI is conscious and make the thought experiment stronger. Assume that artificial consciousness really is possible. Now two very different scenarios become possible. In the first, consciousness emerges inside the artificial system. Nobody uploads a human being into it. The machine simply develops genuine subjective experience of its own. If that happens, we may have created a new kind of conscious life. Its experiences would belong to it. The second scenario is very different. Instead of creating a new consciousness, suppose we try to preserve an existing human consciousness digitally. Imagine someone is dying and technology can reproduce their brain with extraordinary precision. Their memories, personality, and habits and patterns of thought can all be recreated. Science fiction often describes this as uploading the person. But the word upload quietly assumes something important. Copying someone's information and transferring their conscious identity may not be the same thing. To see why, let's return to the experiment from the beginning of this video. Replace one biological neuron with a perfect digital equivalent. It receives the same inputs and produces the same outputs. Would replacing one neuron cause you to stop being you? Probably not. So replace another, then another. You remain awake throughout the procedure. Your thoughts continue while biological components are gradually replaced with digital ones. Nothing obvious marks a moment when one conscious person ends and another begins. Eventually, every biological neuron has been replaced. You still recognize your family. You remember your childhood and the beginning of the procedure. Your personality appears unchanged. You say that you are still you. Perhaps you really are. But what has the experiment actually demonstrated? It has shown continuous behavior, memory, and functioning throughout the replacement. The harder question is whether those things prove that the same conscious subject persisted through the entire process. We can expose that problem by changing the experiment slightly. Instead of replacing the brain gradually, scan it and create a perfect digital version beside the biological person. Give it every memory and every characteristic of the original. Assume again that it is genuinely conscious. Then keep the original alive. Both now exist at the same time, and suddenly a question that seemed almost impossible becomes remarkably simple. Which one is you? Again, the digital person remembers everything about you, your childhood, it recognizes your family, it remembers agreeing to the experiment, and may sincerely believe it has always been you. But you are standing beside it with the same memories and the same conviction. There are now two separate centers of experience. You can see something it cannot. It can have a thought you are not having. However similar they are at the moment of creation, they cannot both be one and the same conscious individual. From that moment, their lives begin to separate. One sees something the other doesn't. That becomes a new memory. Different experiences lead to different thoughts, decisions, and eventually different personalities. After 20 years, they might be dramatically different people. They share the same remembered past up to the moment of copying. But once both conscious subjects exist, each begins its own future. The digital person has not simply preserved a life, it has started one. That leads to an interesting possibility. If a perfect digital copy were genuinely conscious, perhaps we would have created life rather than archived immortality. The new being would begin with someone else's memories. Those memories would feel completely personal. It wouldn't merely know about your childhood. It would remember your childhood as its own. But possessing your remembered past would not necessarily make it the same conscious subject who originally lived that past. Now let's let the biological original die immediately after the copy is created. Suddenly, the situation looks much more like an upload. Only the digital person remains. It remembers entering the procedure and it says, "It worked, I'm still here." And that sounds like excellent evidence until you realize that it's also exactly what a perfect copy would say. When both existed, we had two separate conscious subjects. Removing one doesn't prove that the other was the original all along. This is why destroying the original cannot turn copying into transfer. Imagine the brain is scanned digitally, reconstructed, and then destroyed. There are two possible explanations for what that could lead to. One is that the person moved into the digital system, and the other is that a conscious person was created with the original's memories, while the original conscious person died. If both processes produced exactly the same digital being afterwards, how could we tell which one occurred? I don't think that simply asking the digital person would settle this debate. They would remember entering the procedure, they would recognize everyone they loved, they would sincerely believe that they had survived. Behavioral tests faced the same problem. They could show that the person's information and psychological characteristics were preserved with astonishing accuracy, but a perfect conscious copy would pass those tests as well. We would have excellent evidence the mind was reproduced, not necessarily that the person traveled with it. From my perspective, genuine preservation would require something more. There would have to be an actual transfer rather than copying followed by destruction. Whatever makes the original conscious subject that particular subject would somehow have to pass into the new substrate. And of course, the original would need to lose it because it has moved, not simply because the original brain was destroyed afterwards. Otherwise, I see no clear reason to describe the process as transfer rather than duplication. The obvious problem is that I can't tell you what that transferable thing would be. Nobody currently can. Perhaps future science will show that consciousness can be completely explained by physical processes and that continuity can be measured. Perhaps our idea of personal identity will have to change. Perhaps consciousness works in a way we haven't yet understood. But I think that until we understand that, copying the information contained in a mind and preserving the conscious subject should remain two separate claims. And this brings the AI question back into focus. Can machines process information intelligently? Clearly, yes. Can an artificial system have a genuine subjective experience? We don't know. I would be inclined to say no. Or to be a bit more precise when sharing my opinion here, when I say no, I'm referring to the current AI systems that we have all become very familiar with. Could we eventually create a conscious digital reconstruction of a human being? Perhaps, eventually. Would that reconstruction actually be the same conscious person? That's another question entirely. Creating consciousness, copying a mind, and transferring an existing consciousness are three very different claims. Solving one does not automatically solve the others. If such technology ever becomes real, that final distinction stops being philosophical. Imagine your body is dying. You are told that everything about your mind can be reproduced digitally. The person who wakes up will remember your life, recognize your family, and insist that the procedure worked. But from your perspective, there is only one question that matters. Will you experience waking up? Not whether someone wakes up with your memories, whether you do. And I think that brings us back to the Ship of Theseus. I believe that puzzle is asking whether an object can remain the same while all its parts are replaced. Our bodies show that physical material can change while organized patterns persist. But consciousness adds a different question. If every part of a brain is replaced, it isn't enough to ask whether the resulting system remembers the same life and behaves like the same person. We also have to ask whether the experiencer itself continued throughout the change. Perhaps one day we will understand consciousness well enough to answer that. Perhaps we never will. But until then, words such as upload, transfer, and preserve can hide more than they explain. A digital being could have your memories, your personality, and complete certainty that it is you. It could even be genuinely conscious, but none of that, on its own, proves that your consciousness traveled anywhere. There remains another possibility. You never woke up. Someone else did, carrying every reason to believe they were you. If you enjoyed this kind of video, please make sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.